you very much, and welcome to our first meeting for this semester. I'm extremely pleased to see that there are so many people turning up, and I'm extremely pleased to introduce Professor Rebecca Langlands, who, among other very excellent things I could tell about her, is also a former colleague of mine at Exeter University, so that's another reason to be particularly pleased. And we have an ongoing collaboration which will actually end up in a, I hope it's not the end of it, but it will produce, one of the outcomes will be a conference in May, early May, May 4th and 5th on the history of sexuality. So it's just a heads up, we'll have this event. And if you're around, of course, you're all invited to participate and attend. Professor Langlands is an associate professor in classics at the University of Exeter. She works in Roman literature, culture, ethics, and sexuality. There are two main projects that she's involved in currently, as far as I understand. One has to do with exemplarity. And in fact, a book she's working on right now is Exemplary Ethics in Ancient Rome. And she's working on a project with Kim Peters from Exeter.
She was in Exeter, she's now gone to Australia.
And another project that is more relevant immediately for the talk here and for, I guess, your interests is a collaboration with the Center for Medical History at Exeter, which is in fact a very distinguished center sponsored by the Wellcome Institute, with Professor Kate Fisher. And the project is a project on sex and history. And this also relates to a book on sexual morality in ancient Rome that Professor Langlands published in 2006, and is indeed the topic of the talk today. So I hope you should also be able to tell us more about these particular projects and all the, maybe something about the exhibitions and the public dimension of this work, which is in fact very interesting and remarkable. Thank you very much. Happy to be here.
Thank you very much, Massimo. So, I'm standing here alone in front of you at the lectern today, but the paper that I'm going to present to you this afternoon is the result of an interdisciplinary collaboration with two colleagues in the Centre for Medical History at the University of Exeter, Kate Fisher, who Massimo has just mentioned, and Jana Funke. And they're the co-authors of this paper that I'm going to give, and they've contributed important research to it. And usually when we've written quite a lot of co-authored papers over the years, and usually when we present them, we're all present, and we have a kind of banter going backwards and forwards between ourselves, so it's all quite lively. So I'm afraid today you're going to have to put up with a more traditional monologue from me, but I hope that I'll do my best anyway to represent the collaborative team spirit that has shaped the work that I'm going to tell you about. So before I begin the meat of my talk about the ancient Greek past and the emergence of sexual science, I want to briefly explain this interdisciplinary background from which this paper has emerged. So my longtime collaborator Kate Fisher is a professor of modern history at the University of Exeter, and her research background is especially in sexual practices and sexual attitudes in the early 20th century. She's also a practitioner of oral history, so her early research was based on interviews that she did with people about their sex lives in the 1930s. I myself, as Massimo has said, am a classicist, and my specialism is in Latin literature and Roman culture. And as he mentioned, I've written a book about Roman attitudes towards sex in ancient Rome. So Kate and I, when we first met each other and began to work together, we shared a broad interest in the history of sexuality, but also, more particularly, we shared an interest in the question of why and how people turn to the past in order to help them to develop and to articulate ideas about sex and sexual experience. And so in 2008, we set up within the Centre for Medical History at Exeter a project called Sexual Knowledge, Sexual History, which was funded by the Wellcome Trust. And Jana Funke came to work with us as a postdoctoral fellow in the centre from her background in English literature and studying particularly 19th and 20th century literature and also queer theory and queer temporalities. And she's now a lecturer at Exeter University as well, but continues to collaborate with us. So our aim in the Sexual Knowledge, Sexual History project broadly was to investigate different forms of knowledge about sex that were operational, that have been operational in different periods and different cultures and different cultural practices, and more specifically to explore the role of history and the past, the roles that these played in developing different forms of knowledge and in authorising that knowledge and those forms of knowledge. So we were interested in the past when it was viewed, especially as a kind of data, as evidence about human nature and sexuality. And we were interested in the different kinds of status and authority that the past held in different contexts. And we've also been exploring the way that the practices of making use of the past in modern debates about sex have intersected with the practice of history itself, the practice of the historian, whose aim is to explore, is to study the past itself. So we currently have in press a volume called Sex, Knowledge and Receptions of the Past, which has contributors from a number of different disciplines, and all of them have chapters which are exploring the way that the past is used in a different kind of discourse about sex. And just to mention the museum exhibition that Massimo talked about a moment ago, last year we curated an exhibition of objects from past cultures across the globe, so all kinds of past cultures which had been collected by collectors like Sir Henry Wellcome, who was the person who raised all the money for the Wellcome Trust, which funds the history of medicine and medical projects all around the world now. So Wellcome himself was a big collector of antiquities, sexual antiquities, and we put a number of these objects on display in the museum as a kind of focus for discussion about cultural comparisons of sexuality and thinking about the way those pasts have been utilised in debates about sex and in helping people to understand their own sexuality and talk about sexuality in modern periods. So going back to us, the three of us, the co-authors of this project, we are an interdisciplinary team, but you might think, especially if you are not working in the humanities, if you come from outside the humanities, you might look at us and think a historian, an English literature scholar and a classicist don't represent a very wide range of disciplines, and you can hardly think of it as a sort of particularly challenging form of interdisciplinarity. And to an extent that's the case, and it's true that Kate and Jana and I do share many similar approaches towards materials and also questions of how to do history. In particular, all of us in one way or another are interested in close readings of texts and in looking at the way that reading text can help us to understand cultures and discourses. But nevertheless, we have also found over the years, over all the years that we've been working together, that our different disciplinary backgrounds and trainings and expectations often do bring us into conflict with one another intellectually. And I don't mean that, we're down to sort of, wrestling on the floor, angry with each other. But often we find ourselves, we reach situations where it's clear that we're wanting something different from the material, or that we're coming with a different set of assumptions. And so these situations are really, we're making sense of the material, really bringing different epistemological frameworks, different ways of thinking about material and making sense of them. And these are moments that are particularly valuable because it's then that we are forced to confront our own assumptions and we understand the discipline, the parameters of our own discipline that are holding us back from thinking in new ways and thinking in different ways. So, one of the things that characterises our research, we like to think, is a commitment to real interdisciplinarity as an intellectual force for the good, and also as a way of enabling us to talk to one another, all of us within society, about really important issues. Because often, as academics, when we talk about our research, we can really only be heard by people from within our own disciplines, and this stops us from being able to make a difference, make a real difference in the world. So within our project, we want to find ways to enable different disciplines across academia and also outside academia to benefit from each other's insights and to develop languages through which we can speak to one another. So in the next stage of our research project, which again Massimo was mentioning, will be partly kicking off with the colloquium that we're going to be holding here in May, we're beginning to develop this sort of methodologies and ways of moving this forward. And our ambition is to facilitate productive conversations about sexual knowledge between more diverse groups than us, and to find creative ways of bridging gaps between disciplines who conceptualise knowledge itself in very different ways. So one of our aims of this colloquium that we're holding here is to build up a network that reaches out not only to social scientists and to scientists, but also doctors, therapists and other kind of medical practitioners, practitioners. So that's by way of background. So in the spirit of this interdisciplinary collaboration is the paper today, which is not just the result of interdisciplinary collaboration, but is also in fact about interdisciplinary collaboration between two figures in early sexual science in the late 19th, early 20th century. And part of the aim of this paper is to challenge a prevalent narrative about the medicalisation of sex in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and show that sexual science that emerged in this period was itself fundamentally interdisciplinary. It's not a question of sexual science rejecting history in favour of scientific methods. In fact, sexual science saw history as making an important contribution to the sexological project. So in our recent research, and here when I say our, I do mean more Kate and Jana than myself, because they're currently working on a book project together in this area. But in this research, we've identified this moment in the early 20th century when sexual science opened up and became an interdisciplinary field, where people from different backgrounds exchanged knowledge about sex. People with backgrounds in gynecology, endocrinology, neurology, psychiatry, but also people who didn't have any medical background, literary writers, historians, classicists, theologians, and jurists as well, people working in law, really important contributors to the debates. So at this period, it was understood that all of these disciplines had expertise to contribute to a scientific understanding of sexuality. So, for example, in medical textbooks of the time, you have chapters that engage in great depth with history, and you have sexual scientists who were collectors, like Wellcome was, and who engage with material objects in order to try and understand sex in the past, and that's partly what our exhibition was about, trying to engage with that process. And you also have huge international congresses, like the one that, you can't see because it's too bright in here, but this is a sort of program from an international it's not very important, don't worry about it. It's an international congress from 1914 in Berlin, and you can see that you have medical doctors on the program who are talking about socio-cultural issues, and you have literary writers writing about biomedical issues. So there's a great interdisciplinarity going on in this period. Now, it's not that we're hoping to reclaim this moment and return to this time when disciplines were all able to speak to one another. But we want to make 2 points here. Firstly, as scholars, we've missed the fact that this moment was the way that it was. So we need to rewrite the history of medicalisation to include this interdisciplinary essence of sexual science. And also, it is the case that here we have a historical moment where the kind of interdisciplinary dialogue about sexuality that we are calling for and trying to work towards today is already taking place. So one of the things we want to bear in mind at the back of our minds is, what can this moment tell us, and how can it help us to tackle the challenges about the medicalisation of sex that we are addressing today? So our research, as I said, has been focusing on this particular moment, this particular time in the history of sexuality, the late 19th and early 20th century, when a new way of thinking about sex was emerging, sexual science or sexology. And around the middle of the 19th century, a number of European medical doctors, psychiatrists, psychologists, neurologists and others began to reconfigure sex as a subject worthy of scientific investigation. So we're seeing a period in which science and medicine became increasingly authoritative in shaping the way in which sex is understood. And one of the key ideas that these early sexual scientists came up with and developed is the idea that people's desires can be seen as a manifestation of their biological makeup. So they began to argue that it's possible to identify particular sexual types and to categorise human beings on the basis of their sexual desires. And the implication of this in legal terms was that men who had sex with men were not simply choosing to participate in a form of behaviour that was seen then as being criminal, but they were in fact congenital inverts or homosexuals who were driven by their own internal biological, psychological makeup to desire men rather than women, and that therefore, the argument went, without treatment, they didn't have any choice in the matter. They were simply, in the words of Lady Gaga, born this way. So this moment obviously is one of the central planks in Foucault's argument about what is distinctive about the modern world. It's the moment when sexuality was invented as a discourse as part of a broader medicalisation of our lives, of our identities and of our experiences. So in this paper we want to look more closely at this crucial moment in the history of sexuality and show that the story is a little bit more complicated. This invention of sexuality as a kind of identity, as a personal identity inborn, and the invention of homosexuality in particular, was not a straightforward process. Quite the contrary. We want to demonstrate that the late 19th century is a really interesting moment because there were lots of different ideas of homosexuality that were circulating at the time. And the idea that homosexuality is an inborn congenital condition, something that individuals are simply born with, was not the only available model of explanation. Even though it is now, of course, the model that has ultimately proven to be the most influential and is still very much with us today. So we're going to make this case by looking at a particular case study, the collaboration between Havelock Ellis and John Addington Symonds. And we're looking at these particular individuals firstly because they are, as you'll see, crucially responsible for negotiating and shaping modern understandings of homosexuality. And secondly because their collaboration was very much a model of interdisciplinarity. In fact, one of the things that we can learn by looking at these two men and their collaboration is that questions about the use of history and literature as well were absolutely central to emerging sexual science. And it was clearly not a narrowly defined scientific or medical field that excluded these kind of practices from it. So in this paper, we're going to explore this interdisciplinary nature of early sexual science by looking at the different ways ancient Greece in particular and the classical world were deployed in articulating a scientific understanding of homosexuality. So a brief introduction to these two men, the two protagonists of the paper. Havelock Ellis is remembered as the most eminent English sexologist, and he's famous for the 7 massive volumes that made up his studies in the psychology of sex, which were published between 1897 and 1928. The first volume of this work, which was published for the first time in England in 1897, was called Sexual Inversion. And this book is now widely recognised as the first sustained scientific study of homosexuality in England. So sexual inversion was the term that they were using at the time to describe the phenomenon of men having sex with men. To write Sexual Inversion, to write this first volume of his study, Ellis teamed up with John Addington Symonds, who was a well-known poet, a respected Renaissance scholar and a classicist as well. The interdisciplinary collaboration between the two men has been the focus of a lot of scholarship and discussion. And the research that my colleague Jana has done in the archives and in reading their correspondence has done much to articulate a new way of understanding their collaboration. To sum up a complicated story, Symonds had written a long chapter, a long sort of a short monograph which he wanted to insert as a chapter into Sexual Inversion, which was called A Problem in Greek Ethics, which had first been published in 1883, in which he discussed ancient Greek sources about male sexual relationships and erotic relationships. And particularly the way that the literature and philosophy of this culture that had this great prestige in the 19th century portrayed sex between men, if it was done in the right way, and there are distinctions between those sort of different categories of sex between men, if it was done in the right way as something that was beautiful, that was healthy, that was socially productive, and that was also morally edifying. So Symonds wanted to include this work, this study that he'd done of ancient Greece, in Sexual Inversion because he saw it as a sort of fascinating historical case study that challenged many of the modern ideas about sex between men and could be used as evidence alongside the scientific research of Ellis, which was drawn from the study of modern day case studies. So Ellis's Sexual Inversion is a number of case studies of contemporary people who he's interviewed and documented their lives. And Symonds wanted to have the ancient Greek discussion alongside of that. So Symonds died in 1893, and it was left to Ellis to determine the final shape of the book. And when he was preparing the English editions of Sexual Inversion, Ellis cut Symonds' contributions, including this standalone chapter on ancient Greece. He cut the contributions one by one, and you can sort of just about see that here, that there are a number of JAS, as John Addington Symonds, the initials showing the parts of the book that he initially authored. And by the time we get to the American edition of 1901, all of those chapters have been dropped from the final edition. And by the end, Ellis was no longer acknowledging Symonds as a co-author of the book either. He was the sole author of it. As you can imagine, Ellis's editorial decisions have caused a lot of controversy and speculation over the years, and it's often been argued that Ellis excised Symonds' contributions because he felt that they weren't scientific enough and that they were too historical and too literary. So the general understanding is that Ellis, as this sort of hardcore man of science who was developing these new empirical ways of approaching sexuality, had ruthlessly cut out Symonds' historical contribution once Symonds died, and especially the chapter on Greece, because it had no place in this scientific study of homosexuality that he wanted to present to the world. But in this paper, we want to argue that this kind of antagonistic reading of the relationship between the two men is deeply problematic, and it misunderstands both what Ellis and Symonds individually are trying to achieve in the work, and also the nature of their particular collaboration. And it's also a misunderstanding of sexual science of the time, which was much more open-ended and flexible than we might think in its various forms of evidence, including history, classical material, and literature. So we can learn more about this interdisciplinary makeup of sexual science and the invention of homosexuality by looking more closely at the role of ancient Greece, which, as we've seen, Symonds was really keen to include in sexual inversion when he was writing the book with Ellis. So why ancient Greece? Why was Greece so important in this context? Certainly for Symonds, literature from ancient Greece and especially its celebration of sex between two males played a crucial role in his personal life. It was central to his own self-understanding and his personal identity. Symonds was married and he had several daughters, but he also experienced same-sex desire throughout his life, and he had several relationships with men. The literature of ancient Greece offered him, or so he tells us in his memoirs, an important rhetorical space to negotiate these desires. And in fact, he was part of an elite group of Victorian men who engaged with classical texts to construct a sort of collective, rather elite homoerotic identity, which they sometimes labelled Uranian, which is a word that comes from Plato's Symposium to describe a kind of high intellectual erotic relationship between two males. So there's a really famous passage from Symonds' memoirs, which were never published in his lifetime, but then were published in the 1980s in a kind of heavily edited version, where he recalls the personal impact that reading Plato's Symposium and Phaedrus had on his emerging self-identity. So he tells us about a night spent in his father's library. That night was one of the most important nights of my life. Here in the Phaedrus and the Symposium, in the myth of the soul and the speeches of Pausanias, Agathon and Diotima, I discovered the true liber amoris at last, the revelation I'd been waiting for, the consecration of a long cherished idealism. I had obtained the sanction of the love which had been ruling me from childhood. Here was the poetry, the philosophy of my own enthusiasm for male beauty expressed with all the magic of unrivaled style. And what was more, I now became aware that the Greek race, the actual historical Greeks of antiquity, treated this love seriously, invested it with moral charm, endowed it with sublimity. So here in his memoirs, Symonds is looking back on his life and he's retrospectively presenting his reading of Plato as a turning point that allowed him to discover via ancient Greece a sublime and morally appealing understanding of male same-sex desire, something that was not otherwise available to him in the Victorian world in which he lived. And in particular, the sense in Plato's Symposium and Phaedrus that these relationships were edifying for the participants, that they were part of an education in which sexual favours were exchanged for an initiation into citizenship in ancient Athens. So since the publication of the memoirs in the 1980s, literary critics and historians and classicists have written a lot about this personal dimension of Symonds' life and his personal revelation in response to the classical texts. On a personal level, it's clear that Symonds found the example of Greece liberating and exciting and affirmative. His own desires that he felt for his own classmates and had done for his whole life were validated by ancient Greece, and he took refuge from Victorian opposition or hostility to homosexuality in an ancient Greek world that was both the cradle of the civilization, and so something that was held up for emulation in Victorian society in general, and also a place where, in certain circumstances, love between men was accepted and even celebrated. However, this personal journey story is only part of the story. What we need to understand Symonds not just as a man who's struggling with his own desires, but also as a critical thinker who's interested in political and social realities and who's keen to negotiate and capitalise on this validating literature from ancient Greece, so as to help bring about a different future for his own society in general, and specifically for men who desire other men. He was keen to challenge pejorative views of male homosexuality that were prevalent in his own society, and also generally in emerging European sexological literature of the day. And he hoped that accounts from ancient Greece could play a central part in bringing about this change. Indeed, Symonds was writing at a crucial juncture, at a moment when modern understandings of homosexuality were first generated, and he played a central part in shaping these debates, especially in England. What's less well understood than the personal relevance of Greece to Symonds' own identity, then, is his ongoing struggle to co-opt ancient Greece into a bid to shape affirmative understandings of homosexuality on a broader political and social level. For Symonds, Greece was of immense importance in his thinking, but it also posed all sorts of problems, as we'll see. In fact, he struggled throughout his life to find a politically viable way of using ancient Greece in this context of the real world that he lived in. The radical difference between ancient Greece and the modern world, which had been personally enlightening for him, posed practical problems in here. As Symonds looked to bring about real social change, he had to adapt his thinking about how it was that Greece could inform that vision of a better world. And when he began to collaborate with Ellis, in particular, Symonds recognised that the interpretation of Greece that had been dominant in his earlier writings would not suit their shared political project. Both men agreed, a number of problems and difficulties that involved in marshalling ancient Greek history in the service of modern homosexual politics that needed to be negotiated carefully. So as a result, over the course of his lifetime, we find Symonds writing different kinds of texts about ancient Greek homosexuality, not because, as some have argued, his thinking was simply incoherent, or because he was so personally troubled by his own desires that he couldn't come up with a coherent argument, or because he was trying to please Havelock Ellis, but because Symonds continued to experiment with how he could use ancient Greece strategically to articulate different possible understandings of male homosexuality. And such different depictions of Greece were used under different circumstances, for different audiences, and for different political purposes, which required different strategies. So, we can chart significant shifts in Symonds' negotiation and reception of ancient Greece. I will discuss in this paper briefly 3 core publications on male homosexuality. So we have the first publication in 1883 is A Problem in Greek Ethics, which I've mentioned already, where he talks about the ancient Greek material that celebrates love between men, sexual relations between men. And the full title is A Problem in Greek Ethics, being an inquiry into the phenomenon of sexual inversion, addressed especially to medical psychologists and jurists. And that's important, the kind of context is that his audience for these works were medical professionals, medical psychologists and people who were involved in the law. In 1891, he writes A Problem in Modern Ethics, addressed to the same audience. And in 1897, of course, we have Sexual Inversion, the first English version, which he co-authored with Ellis. And what's fascinating about looking at these texts all together is that we can see very clearly how Symonds' writing became more overtly and explicitly political in focus as he went through his life, and how his use of Greece, ancient Greece, has to change and adapt as a result. So, Symonds' reception of Greece can't be understood without paying attention to the fact that he was writing in a bid to change social attitudes and bring about social change. And it's by looking at these crucial differences, crucial uses of the Greek past, that we can gain key insights into the complexities of this crucial moment in the history of male homosexuality, sexual science, and also early proto-gay politics. In fact, what we can show you here is that some of the ideas that we take for granted about sexual identity today and homosexuality, that we might think of as just the way it is, were actively shaped by people like Symonds in this particular historical moment and for particular purposes. We can already see Symonds' very careful negotiation of ancient Greece in the service of present-day concerns in his first sustained treatise on male same-sex desire, Problem in Greek Ethics. And the open paragraph, which I have here, is crucial in setting out who his audience is and also the purpose of this treatise that he's written. So he writes, "For the student of sexual inversion, ancient Greece offers a wide field for observation and reflection. Its importance has hitherto been underrated by medical and legal writers on the subject, who do not seem to be aware that here alone in history we have the example of a great and highly developed race not only tolerating homosexual passions, but deeming them of spiritual value and attempting to utilise them for the benefit of society. So rather than setting out to deal with the Greek past in its own terms and for its own sake, Symonds makes it clear that this text is addressed to the student of what Symonds calls here sexual inversion or homosexual passion, and especially medical and legal writers on the subject. And the use of terminology here is crucial. Symonds was the first person to use the term homosexual in English, and the fact that he's already using this term as well as the new term inversion makes it clear that he was already at this early moment in the 1870s and 1880s trying to understand how ancient Greece could work in conjunction with emerging modern understandings of what was being called homosexuality or inversion. And of course the meaning of these terms wasn't, as we'll see, fixed or determined at this point. In fact, we need to recognise that Symonds was a key architect of these terms, especially in the English context, and the shifting negotiation of the Greek past played a central yet often overlooked part in shaping the meaning of these terms. So what was Symonds' agenda? What was he trying to teach the medical psychologists and jurists who were addressed in these books? And why did he turn to Greece to try and teach them something new or different about homosexuality? To understand what Symonds is doing here, we need to know that there were really two ideas about male-male sex, about men having sex with each other, that were circulating in Victorian society that Symonds wanted to challenge. First of all, what he called the pathological hypothesis, and second, a moral panic about the corruption of youth. So, on the first one, the pathological hypothesis, when early sexual scientists began to understand homosexuality as a kind of identity, a kind of congenital condition, something that you were born with, this kind of idea started out with very negative connotations. The understanding was not just that some people are born homosexual and others not, and that was a kind of neutral fact, but that being born homosexual was a form of disease or illness. So the homosexual is usually seen as a pathological or degenerate figure in culture. So this was a key aspect of existing European scholarship on sex and sexological matters that Symonds wanted to challenge. And having surveyed previous works of European sexual science by people like Richard von Krafft-Ebing, Symonds wrote to Ellis in the 1890s to attack what he called this pathological hypothesis of the medical and forensic authorities, who maintained that homosexuality was necessarily morbid or pathological, and who reached their conclusions on the basis of limited evidence. One of the things he complains about is that a lot of them take as their subjects criminals, prostitutes, and then base on these studies the idea that most homosexuals are criminals or prostitutes. So he has a problem with the kind of the data set that they use. And he felt in particular that a study of ancient Greece could help to change these kind of views. And ancient history provided evidence that homosexuality was not necessarily always pathological, but could also find healthy expressions. And ancient Greek literature could serve to demonstrate that homosexual men were not always and necessarily degenerate, sick or unhealthy, and unable to contribute to their society in a useful way. And he felt that the bias of this European sexual science could be rectified if these sexologists would only observe the healthy, successful, respectable homosexual men who were on show in the ancient Greek literature. And he also maintained that it was the history of ancient Greece that provided the most important corrective to these kind of ideas. So he writes, "The so-called scientific psychiatrists are ludicrously in error by diagnosing as necessarily morbid what was the leading emotion of the best and noblest men in Hellas. They do not only not know ancient Greece, they don't know their own cousins and clubmates." And again, part of his argument was that they were focusing on the kind of on the degenerate and criminal elements in society, but they were blind to the fact that there were lots of men in all echelons of society who were involved in having sexual relationships with each other, and they were just choosing to ignore this fact. So Greece, with its rich supply of noble, good men who also happened to experience same-sex desires, could be used to challenge and correct this contemporary and prevalent view of homosexuality as a form of pathology, a disease, a form of degeneration, especially given the very high status of ancient Greece within Victorian society. So far so good. That looks like it should work pretty well as an argument in this case. But Symonds ran into another problem that related to a second preconception about homosexuality, which was a particular kind of moral panic, a set of fears and anxiety around homosexuality that had taken hold of Victorian society. And these anxieties centred around the fear that homosexuality might spread, that it was a kind of contagious disease that might spread and damage society. And there were particular fears that young people were vulnerable, they could easily be seduced and corrupted, and that the spread of homosexuality would ultimately end up weakening and destroying whole nations and races and endangering their strength and stability in the present and the future. And these ideas about the corruption and seduction of youth pose a really significant challenge for Symonds in his attempt to reach back to Greece to demonstrate the nobility or the health of the homosexual, which is something we can already see him dealing with in a problem in Greek ethics. So the problem that Symonds encountered when he was trying to recover Greece as a positive model in this way was that the male-male relationships in ancient Greece that were described were relationships which were of men who were of unequal age. They were a relationship between an older man and a younger man or a boy. And Symonds and many of his contemporaries felt that this wasn't necessarily a bad thing, and it was possible to argue that the cultural excellence of ancient Greece was partly due to the beneficial formative influence of Platonic eros, which allowed young men to benefit from their close relationships with older men. So this is very much arguments that are put forward in Plato's Symposium, the idea that the older man chooses a young man of good character and teaches him the ways, teaches him about virtue and how to be a good citizen, and that's a really important educational element of the pederastic relationship. So the argument that they put forward and that Symonds was also drawing on was that these age unequal relationships between males were furthering the good of the individual and the society as a whole, and generations of younger men and boys could be seen to benefit from their relationships with older men. However, translating this model, this pederastic model of Greek love into the present day was fraught with difficulties precisely because of the extreme anxieties around the corruption and seduction of youth that were current at the time. And there were even fears about the influence of classics on young minds and worries that reading Plato and other Greek texts might encourage students to develop same-sex desires, which is something that Symonds himself believed, and you can sort of see part of that in his memoirs where he's talking about the revelation of reading Plato's Symposium. And these kind of anxieties about the influence of the classics were exacerbated by rumours that circulated about improper relationships between teachers and students at public schools like Eton and Harrow in England and at the universities of Oxford and Cambridge, and Symonds himself was implicated in some of these scandals. And in the 1870s, his own classical scholarship was presented as a corrupting influence on England's youth in a critical article published in the Contemporary Review. So this all proved to Symonds that it was becoming increasingly difficult to affirm the ideal of Greek love as the pedagogic eros, because it was conflated with ideas about the corruption of youth. So a problem in Greek ethics, his 1883 work, tries to respond to these fears. Symonds calls attention to the importance of paiderastia, which is the word he uses to describe this, the importance of paiderastia to Greek achievements, and he's explicit about the age difference that is at the heart of the relationship. But he also clearly tries to make the point that this form of desire was not necessarily a corruptive or immoral influence, and he explains that Greek love was the passionate and enthusiastic attachment subsisting between man and youth, recognised by society and protected by opinion, which, though it was not free from sensuality, did not degenerate into mere licentiousness. So in this kind of formulation, he's echoing, again, a distinction that's made in the ancient texts in Plato's Symposium between two different kinds of eros. The kind of high-minded Uranian eros, which is between a man and a slightly older boy, a boy who has reached adolescence, who is intellectually capable of having the kind of relationship, a sort of spiritual comradeship that goes along with the erotic experience. And so that kind of love is distinguished from the baser, lower kind of love, the democratic love, which is really just based on physical lust. And in Plato's Symposium, the speaker Phaedrus says that the kind of people who are really only interested in lust and the body are actually are attracted towards younger boys and women who are naturally intellectually weaker and less interesting as individual people, precisely because they're easier to corrupt and they're easier to persuade to have sex with them in a kind of fleeting and sort of meaningless way. So the kind of person who's interested in the higher form of love will be attracted to a slightly older adolescent boy because he is capable of the kind of proper intellectual, fulfilling erotic relationship that a noble man should be after. Which does involve sexual relations, but is also, but has more to it than that. So, in this text, in Greek ethics, Symonds is still using the language of what he calls boy love, and he's open about the fact that Greek relations were age unequal. But he's also careful to highlight this Uranian, noble, spiritual element of Platonic eros, which would be lost if the younger partner in a pederastic relationship were too young and couldn't benefit from the educational, intellectual influence of the older partner. So, in this text, Symonds is testing out the usefulness of a Platonic version of Greek love as age unequal yet beneficial, especially for the younger partner. But this isn't the version of Greece that he would be able to hold on to, given the fears about corruption and seduction of youth became stronger and stronger over the course of the 19th century. So as a result, he had to change his use of Greece and his representation of ancient Greek ideas. And he did. By the time he wrote A Problem in Modern Ethics, which was published in 1891, at a time when there was, for example, a lot of debate going on in Europe about the age of consent, and particularly in England about child prostitution. So by the time he wrote this text, the age-differentiated structure of Greek love is completely elided from his account of ancient Greece. There's no more reference to pederastic relationships or boy love, and homosexual relationships are explicitly between adult men rather than between a man and a boy. Already in 1873, and certainly by the 1880s then, Symonds recognised that using the Greek past to celebrate a pedagogic eros was a very problematic strategy to bring about social change. And in fact, rather than changing social views on homosexuality, this argument was more likely to feed into and foster fears about the corruption or seduction of youth, and to play into the moral panic about same-sex desire between men that existed in the 19th century. And the political importance of rejecting any suggestion that homosexuality might be about relationships between older and younger men is also revealed by the last line of Sexual Inversion, which is in some ways Symonds' final say on homosexuality. So this is the last line of the book, the co-authored book. If two male persons who have reached the years of discretion consent together to perform some act of intimacy in private, no indecency has been committed. And I think this articulation has a very contemporary, modern feel to it. It speaks to us in the present day. As most brands of gay politics today are precisely about defending and making a case for this model of homosexuality, this age-equal, consensual model. And of course, consent has come to be really important in our articulations of sexual morality and law as well. And looking at Symonds and his reception of Greece can give us an insight into how this modern understanding of homosexuality was shaped and the difficulties involved in this process. So while Symonds became more and more wary about the issue of age difference, he didn't want to give up on the idea that same-sex desire between men could be seen as a force that was beneficial to society, that could improve individual lives and also improve broader society more generally. So in his later publication, A Problem in Modern Ethics, which was written in 1889 and privately printed in 1891, he tries out a different strategy to utilise the Greek past and articulate a powerful vision of the futures of society and human relations. As a whole, the problem in modern ethics is no longer about Greece, but Greece still plays a central role, particularly in the final chapter, which is entitled Literature Idealistic, and is dedicated to the work of Walt Whitman, the American poet who had published the first edition of his famous collection Leaves of Grass in 1855. It's in this chapter, in this final chapter, and through his reading of Whitman, that Symonds tries out a different strategy to achieve what he'd already attempted in A Problem in Greek Ethics, to articulate an understanding of male-male relations and erotics as a powerful force that could strengthen society and play a crucial role in shaping the future of a society. He wants to use another key motif from Greek literature, in particular about the erotic relationships between Greeks, but particularly the Dorian Greeks. to demonstrate that same-sex desire was not itself a corruptive force that led to weaker and more degenerate society, which were the ideas that were prevalent in his own society, but quite the contrary, that it could actually ennoble and strengthen bonds between men and lead to a stronger and more cohesive society. So particularly important here are ancient discussions of the outstanding masculinity of the kind of men who were involved in these erotic relationships with other men. So sexual relationships between the Homeric hero Achilles and Patroclus, and then there are historical figures Harmodius and Aristogeiton, and in particular the idea that was frequently expressed in ancient Greek texts that the best army of all is the kind that's made up of pairs of lovers, because it's in this loving relationship that men are most inspired to virtue and courage on the battlefield. They don't want to let their lover down, they don't want to look weak or cowardly in front of their lover. So this is an idea in Greek literature that Symonds then chose to emphasise and draw on in a problem in modern ethics. So we can see here a different strategic interpretation of the Greek past in the service of present-day concerns and also future possibilities. And Whitman was crucial for Symonds in making this new reading of Greece possible. It was via Whitman that Symonds felt he might be able to reach back to Greece and articulate its significance and relevance for the present and the future. Because in some of his poems, Whitman lays out a vision of manly bonds, what he calls comradeship, that had similarities with the close and loving bonds that existed, as far as Symonds saw, between men in ancient Greece, and especially among the Dorians, in which Symonds was particularly interested. So in Symonds' own words, Whitman recognises among the sacred emotions and social virtues destined to regenerate political life and to cement nations an intense, jealous, throbbing, sensitive, expectant love of man for man, comradeship. He proclaims this love to be not only a daily fact in the present, but also a saving and ennobling aspiration. So Whitman offers Symonds this new reading of love of man for man, one that placed bonds between men, loving comradeship in the surface of a democratic future. And Symonds dreamed that, as in ancient Greece, the affirmation of such bonds between men could bring a stronger, more noble, more excellent culture in the future. And he hoped that a society that accepted or even encouraged such bonds between men would be a society in which same-sex desire could be detached from any base lust or vulgar indulgence, which was, for Symonds, the kind of base lust and the sort of degeneration was symptomatic of the fact that in the modern world that was so hostile towards homosexuality, male-male bonds weren't allowed to flourish in the healthy way that they could if society were different. So he says, if this be not a dream, are we perhaps justified in foreseeing here, in Whitman's poetry and prose, the advent of an enthusiasm which shall rehabilitate those outcast instincts? So he's characterising homosexual instincts in his current society as being marginalised and pushed into situations where they're having to kind of express themselves in criminal ways. Then he's saying if we could see a new kind of culture, we could rehabilitate those instincts by giving them a spiritual atmosphere, an environment of recognised and healthy emotions wherein to expand at liberty and purge away the grossness and the madness of their pariahdom. In other words, via Whitman, Symonds could dream of this Greek future in which same-sex desire was at the heart of social change and improvement, and in which same-sex desire could once again be expressed in its pure and noble form. Now, of course, what precisely this loving comradeship involved was very much up for debate, and Symonds actually wrote to Whitman to press him on whether he intended comradeship to include sexual relationships, and Whitman said absolutely not. But Symonds, especially towards the end of his life, affirmed the physical and sexual elements of comradeship quite explicitly. But he also at the same time remained invested in this Platonic ideal of the heavenly love, the love that had a very important spiritual, intellectual element to it as well as sensual. But the bigger point for Symonds was that the ideal of comradeship promised a world in which different close relationships and bonds between all men, whether they were sexual or not, were valorised and appreciated. And indeed, one thing to note in this context is that the shift away from age difference that we charted in the previous section, what became important instead of age difference was a question of class difference. So class unequal relationships between upper class and lower class men were very much, as is well known, eroticised by Symonds and many of his contemporaries like Oscar Wilde and Edward Carpenter, who were sexually attracted to working class men and had relationships with them. And this aspect of so-called Greek love, we might find it problematic in its fetishization of working class masculinity and its eroticization of class hierarchies. But it was also for Symonds an important element of reworking Greek love to make Greek love speak directly to visions about the future, and creating a privileged place for male-male relations in Greek love. So Symonds had this view that sexual relationships might actually be able to break down class distinctions, that relationships between upper and lower class men were a way of forging bonds that would would transcend class hierarchies, and that society would be able to renew and strengthen itself in the future by affirming these loving bonds between men of different classes. And it was a force that could unite all of mankind, work across class divisions, create strong ties between all men. It was in this sort of vision of a democratic society that Symonds glimpsed this possibility of a Greek future. And he was actually really interested in, as well, in medieval chivalry, and this idea that in the Middle Ages, the relationship between a man and a woman was held up as a great model, which it sort of went beyond the erotic. It eroticized relationships, but it also went beyond the erotic. And I think he sort of had an idea that a similar kind of homosexual type of chivalric code might be forged for the bettering of society. So he dedicated an entire chapter in a problem in modern ethics to fleshing out this vision of the future. But at the same time, he repeatedly emphasised how unrealistic this vision was. In A Problem in Modern Ethics, he concedes this prospect, like all ideals until they're realised and experienced, may seem fantastically visionary. And he concludes the chapter on a defeatist note: the time has not yet come to raise the question of whether the love of man for man shall be elevated through an hitherto unapprehended chivalry to nobler powers. This question at the present moment is deficient in actuality. The world cannot be invited to entertain it. And the defeatist tone is echoed in his memoirs, where he declares that we cannot be Greek now, and his private correspondence as well. In a letter to Edmund Goss, for instance, he explains, with regard to some of his poems, they're meant to illustrate Greek philia, friendship. Of course, this Greek love is different in quality from what can be expected to flourish in the modern world, and to attempt to replant it would be anachronistic. So this more pessimistic attitude towards the possibility of a Greek future becomes more pronounced towards the end of Symonds' life. But Symonds didn't abandon ancient Greece entirely. Instead, as we'll show in the final section of our paper, Symonds, towards the end of his life, develops yet another way of using the Greek past that's very different, again, from the vision of the Greek future that he had tentatively suggested in A Problem for Modern Ethics. And this final use of Greece was developed in the context of Symonds' collaboration with Ellis on sexual inversion, his move into the field of sexual science, and his desire to engage more directly in public and political debates about homosexuality. And we've mentioned earlier the collaboration between Symonds and Ellis has often been misunderstood. In particular, their relationship has been viewed antagonistically, with Symonds being misrepresented as a kind of imaginative man of letters with an interest in Greek history that was supposedly at odds with Ellis's scientific methodology. But what we want to argue is that Ellis didn't just chuck out Symonds' use of Greece because it was unscientific. In fact, the two of them together jointly negotiated the use of Greece in a bid to construct a model of modern homosexuality and proto-gay politics that would prove very influential and that's still with us today. To understand what's happening here, it's crucial to point out that Ellis, it's clear from their private correspondence, was very much in line with Symonds' desire to challenge continental sexual science and to work against the idea that homosexuality was necessarily morbid and pathological. Both Ellis and Symonds wanted to find a powerful, viable way to change social attitudes towards homosexuality and eventually to decriminalise it in England. And it was this joint investment in a politically viable strategy that would facilitate the shift away from a vision of Greek future that Symonds still wanted to hold on to, albeit tentatively, in A Problem in Modern Ethics. So the relationship between ancient Greek sexual relationships and homosexuality in the modern world is discussed at length in many of the letters that were exchanged between Ellis and Symonds between 1890 and 1883. And ultimately, they both agreed that there was no easy way to reconcile the two. They both maintained that what they called sexual inversion in the present was fundamentally different from same-sex desire in ancient Greece. Ellis articulated this problem in a letter from July 1892. I should not expect Epaminondas to be abnormal like Verlaine, still less the boy or girl among the Eskimos who's brought up by its parents to sex inversion. I'm not quite sure whether you agree. To me, the point seems fairly clear. The point Ellis is making here is about the role of cultural difference in shaping sexual identity of the individual. And this is just a statue of Epaminondas, the famous Theban general. And he's saying that he's asking why would you expect this Theban general living in the 4th century BCE to have similar ideas about sexual experience and sexual desires as a 19th century French poet. And he explains that the Greek same-sex desire must be fundamentally different from modern homosexuality because it's happening in a different context. In modern Western world in which they lived, homosexual desire was pathologized and criminalized. And in this hostile environment, it was unlikely for individuals to acquire homosexuality or homosexual desires. It made more sense to suppose that homosexual desires were largely inborn or congenital. In ancient Greece, on the other hand, same-sex desire was not only accepted but actually encouraged among young boys, and they believed the case to have been the same among the Eskimos that Ellis mentions in this quotation as well. So it's likely then that the same-sex desire in ancient Greece was acquired via acculturation a lot of the time rather than necessarily always inborn, and also that it's difficult to tell the difference between the two. Now, of course, for Symonds, that's partly the point. Symonds' dream of a Greek future, as articulated in A Problem in Modern Ethics, involved a return to this kind of society in which all men could engage in male-male bonds of comradeship, irrespective of their inborn congenital desires. So the point of his utopian vision of a Greek future was that all men could be united in this comradely love. But the vision of the future, as we've seen, was increasingly problematic in the context of these heightened anxieties about corruption and seduction, and the spread of homosexual desire and so on. So in fact, Symonds' vision of a Greek future in which every man would be encouraged to engage in homoerotic bonding fed directly into Victorian fears about the spread of homosexual desires, and therefore it couldn't be seen as a viable strategy to achieve social and political and legal change. So it's for this reason that Symonds and Ellis had to negotiate ancient Greece in a different way and develop a new strategy. And this strategy would involve, finally, the retreat to the individual and to individual identity categories that had begun to be articulated in earlier sexual science. So what Symonds and Ellis chose to do was to reinforce the idea that the homosexual in the modern world, in their world, was a discrete kind of individual, a species or a type, to use Foucault's terminology. Although they sought to challenge the idea that this type of being was necessarily pathological or sick or degenerate or morbid. And here again, Greece could once again play a role, though it was a more modest one. Ancient Greece continued to be important, but it wasn't as a unique, special culture that stood out from other kinds of historical cultures. Rather now, Greece was used alongside other cultural periods such as the Renaissance to offer evidence of excellent individuals, such as Epaminondas, who were noble and brave and who contributed to society despite their desire and despite having sexual relations with other men. So what we find here in Symonds and Ellis is the beginning of a form of gay history that we're familiar with today, which involves turning to the past to identify predecessors or exemplary individuals that can be placed in the service of a liberationist gay politics. This use of the past was, of course, directly tied to the desire of bringing about social change. Indeed, the past could play a central role in providing evidence of individuals that could demonstrate the health, the respectability, the potential social contributions made by homosexual men, which Ellis and Symonds agreed should be acknowledged by society. Now, Ellis and Symonds would settle on this use of ancient Greece to accomplish their shared goal, to challenge pathological understandings of homosexuality. So rather than use ancient Greece to call for radical changes in the social organisation of sexuality, an ambitious idea which they could have moved in that direction, to call for a Greek future without fixed sexual identities in which all men were united in comradely love, they decided instead to use Greece along with other historical and anthropological materials to demonstrate that the sexual invert or homosexual could be a healthy, respectable, contributing member of society. And in doing so, they reinforced the idea that the homosexual was an identifiable type, a form of identity that could be traced across history. But they renegotiated this concept of sexual identity to prove the health of the sexual invert and indicate his social responsibility. So in conclusion, throughout his life and throughout his collaboration with Havelock Ellis, Symonds continued to take the classical past seriously and to see knowledge about attitudes to same-sex love in ancient Greece as having a genuine value for discussions about sex in the modern world. However, this ancient Greece was not a fixed point of reference, but was itself represented and interpreted differently depending on Symonds' shifting perspectives and the shifting requirements, social requirements. It could be seen as a source of important information about human nature and the possibilities for human societies past and future. It could be a personal inspiration, but it could also be used rhetorically, strategically, to help make persuasive arguments which were designed to challenge and transform contemporary attitudes towards sex between men. And one of the key points we want to make here is that the past continued to be important to Symonds even once he began to collaborate with Ellis, and that it was important to their shared sexological scientific project. So what we see in their collaboration, finally, is not the scientist Ellis cutting out all the literary historical waffle that detracted from the pure science of the sexual inversion project. The letters between the two men reveal a thoughtful, interdisciplinary, genuine collaboration between them, of the kind that myself and Jana and Kate are also familiar with in our own work. As they shared their ideas and their material with one another across their discipline boundaries, they came to believe together that the world was not ready for the Dorian model of a whole society ennobled by erotic comradeship involving men across all classes. They agreed that what was needed instead was a model which kept the homosexual and the heterosexual apart in two separate categories, in a way that would allay contemporary fears about the potential for corruption and the spreading of the new homosexual disease throughout society. Their story is indeed about the drawing of new boundaries, but they're not the disciplinary boundaries between humanities and science, which are strongly drawn today and which scholars have often misleadingly thought were a barrier to the collaboration between the two men. Those remain fluid through their collaboration. History remained an important part of the scientific project. The boundaries in question here are the boundaries between the category of homosexual and heterosexual, as mutually exclusive identity categories, which still remain so powerful today. Thank you very much.